Welcome everybody to another Agora webinar, part of our webinar series, which we started beginning of April, just after the lockdown. It's the 10th webinar actually today, so we do have a little anniversary. The topic is unlocking renewables in Southeast Europe through financial de-risking policies. And this is what you're gonna learn something about today. Now, Agora Energiewende, for the ones who do not know us, we are an independent think tank funded by two foundations. Most of us are based in Berlin, some in Beijing, Brussels, and Bregenz. So we only go to cities that start with a B. And we are currently some 45 colleagues. And yes. Today, who's on the podium? You see my colleague Sonja Risteska, who's from the EU team. She's project manager Southeast Europe and will be here today to present part of the study. And then we also have Christian Rede. He's also working for the EU team of Agora Energiewende. He's a senior associate European Energy Cooperation. Welcome, Christian. You also see Christoph Podewils, who's the Director of Communications at Agora Energiewende, and he will primarily take care of all the incoming questions during our Q&A session at the end. My name is Nicola Bock. I'm Head of Events at Agora Energiewende, and I will lead you through this webinar. You may also see one telephone number. This is actually Christian's telephone working as a microphone because the connection from the laptop was a little weak, so we decided to tune him in via his telephone. So there's no one from Zoom or any stranger. It's just Christian with his telephone. Right, so what's going to happen during the next hour? We will have a presentation by Sonja and Christian that will last for about 20 to 25 minutes. And then we will have enough time for a Q&A session. So you can ask all the questions and remarks that you have. You have two ways of getting in contact with us. Unfortunately, we cannot see you. It would be great if it was different, because I'm sure we would recognize some of your faces. However, we have to work with Zoom, and you have two options. If you check the bottom of your screen, you have two buttons. And actually, one is the chat button and the other one is the Q&A, or for the ones dialing in from Germany, F&A button. It would be great if you use the chat button only for any technical issues you might face. So if you cannot hear us anymore, if the screen is frozen or something, put it in there so we can sort for a solution. Everything you put in the chat will not be visible to the audience, only to us on the podium. Right? We will also use the chat to inform you about relevant links. For instance, we have already uploaded the presentation that Sonja and Christian will show in a few minutes on our website, and I believe Christoph has already put the link into the chat, or will do so soon. We will also put relevant email addresses in there, and any other links we think may be useful for you. Okay. The other button is the Q&A button. Use this for your content-related questions, please. So anything that comes up during the presentation, put it in there. It remains invisible to the audience until Christoph picks it. And once he's picked a question, it will become visible for the rest of the audience. Which brings me to my last part of the introductory part. We are recording the webinar. You can see that on the top left, because we would like to make it available for anyone who cannot attend, or also for you to rewatch it. That means if you do not want to leave any footprints in the World Wide Net, you should refrain from putting your questions into the Q&A session, because, as I just said, it might be picked and become visible to the audience. Right. That's everything I think you need to know in order to join us happily until the end of the webinar. So before I hand over to Sonja and Christian, we have prepared a little poll again because we like it so much, and also we'd like to get to know you a little better. Of course, we can see your names, but it would be great to also find out something about your background. And I will just call upon our poll, which you should be able to see right now. I will read it out because this is not going to be recorded. I mean, people who see the recording cannot see the poll actually, so I'm going to read it. Where are you based? 1, EU member state in Southeast Europe. 2, country in the Western Balkans. 3, other country in Europe. 4, outside Europe. I can see people are voting. There's still some movement. And then regarding your professional background, what is your professional background? 1, energy utility sector. 2, renewables developer. 3, financing sector. 4, government sector. 5, academia. 6, non-government organization. 7, other. And now that is such a long list, I believe I can soon finish the poll. I give it another 3 seconds, so who hasn't voted can still, or hasn't given an answer can still do so. And I will stop it now, and you'll be able to see the results once I make them public. Right, you should be able to see them now. So as we can see, 53%, which equals 41 persons, are from other countries in Europe, followed by 22% EU member state in Southeast Europe, and then 16% are from a country in the Western Balkans, and 9%, which equals 7 persons, are from outside Europe. And then regarding the professional background, that's pretty, there's no like one winner. We have 19% other, so that's 15 persons. Then followed by 18% from the energy utility sector, that's no surprise. And then what's next? 16% academia, and then 14% government sector or renewables developer, 10% from non-government organizations, and 8% from the financing sector. So that's quite evenly, how do you say, divided, or, well, interesting enough. I will stop the poll now, hand over to you two, and hope you have a clearer picture of who you're presenting to now. The floor is yours, Sonia.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you for the lovely intro and for the poll. Good day, everybody, also from my name. As Nicola already presented, me and my colleague Christian, who work in the Europe team, will present the results of a study we worked on last year, which deals with the financial mechanism or ways how to de-risk renewables in Southeast Europe. Specifically for onshore wind. I will deal with also with the slides today, and of course I'm looking forward to, I would say, the discussion later. So let's start first with the power mix in Europe. As you can see on the slide, basically the development of wind and PV in the EU and how it's exponentially is growing. More than 30% actually of the power mix in Europe in 2018 and also 2019 has been from renewables, and mostly that part it's wind and solar, which means that the sector is quite good in its development and it's growing continuously. But there is always a but. To reach the targets that the EU has set for itself in 2030, the renewables must be deployed twice the speed compared to the last decade. We are talking, of course, here specifically for wind and solar. Of course, I mean, considering the pandemic crisis, 2020 will probably be a bit of a completely different year of how it was in the past. But of course, that's a completely different situation. So what we are looking at here specifically is where we are today and where we want to be in 2030, especially if we have even higher targets, and how to get there. And if we want to get there in 2030, what needs to be done, and then specifically of how fast we need to develop the renewables sector, which leads us, of course, to the European Green Deal. As you know, it was recently announced by the European Commission, by its President Ursula von der Leyen. It's a way, it's a path to decarbonize EU up until 2050. It involves all the sectors of the society, and it promotes, of course, robust, just, and deep energy transition. The first step of it would be to increase the climate target for 2030. That's something that's currently ongoing, of course, because of the crisis. Again, things have been a bit delayed, but in any case, what is the idea? The idea is to have at least 50% reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 compared to 1990 levels. There are, of course, steps for this to be achieved: deployment of renewables, coal phase out in Europe, smart sector transformation, integration, heating, transport, industry, etc. What's important, I would say, specifically for Southeast Europe is, of course, the just transition part. These countries most of them have not announced any coal phase out up until today, apart from Greece, which means that the next 10 years will be crucial in these matters. And because they will be hard hit, the EU is planning this big fund in order to help them bridge, I would say, the coal phase out processes. Where does this lead us in our today's presentation? Well, it leads us to the deployment of the renewables in order for EU, but the continent itself, to reach the targets for 2030 and 2050. What are the preconditions for the energy transition in Southeast Europe? We all know, in one way or another, there have been many studies where the conclusion is that the potentials for renewables in Southeast Europe are quite good. They're there. They just need to be utilized. But there are reasons why they're not. And that's why we are here today. To unlock basically the renewables deployment and every related opportunities that brings, from jobs, from cleaner air, security of supply, etc., etc. There need to be several policies implemented. From gradual phase out of coal, of course, renewables targets, to cooperate regionally, to integrate the power markets, because this is still a small region with fragmented markets. And of course, to remove the regulatory barriers and to lower the financing risks for renewables, for large and for small scale renewables. I mean, on this slide, basically you see from IRENA's study, what it means when you have high cost of capital. That's the pink line. And basically that when you have expensive investments, that then the potential that it's utilized from wind, it's only around 32 gigawatts. But if the cost of capital is actually cheaper and it's more available, then the utilized wind potential jumps to more than 200 gigawatts. So how to change this and how to have this potential utilized? We need to have robust frameworks, smart financing instruments. The EU is already working on this. Yes, we know renewables, the cost of technology is cheaper, and yes, we know the region has still high cost of capital, is facing high cost of capital simply because the risks perceived in these regions are higher, which means it impacts the upfront investments, the upfront costs that investors face, which means it makes their investment in specifically wind and in solar in this region more risky, more expensive than compared to, for instance, France, Germany, or the Nordic countries. So even the EU, as I said, is already planning instruments, financial mechanisms to support countries which face high cost of capital. Some of those instruments are the ones that we will talk today. They're de-risking renewable energy investments from InvestEU in the next EU budget. The other one is renewable energy projects of European interest. And the third one, which is also currently being put for public discussion in the EU, and that's the EU Renewable Energy Financing Mechanism, which should support EU countries specifically to bridge the gap of renewables between where they are today and where they should be in 2030 in their NECPs. We tried to also get into this debate and sort of do research on the ground and see where the countries are in Southeast Europe now, and basically how to lower the cost of capital in this region. My colleague Christian will do the deep dive into the results of the study. I will just say that something that's very specific for Agora, when we do studies, we always have on the first page these 4 main points of the study. So if you don't have the time to read the study, sometimes just read these 4 points, and then you will see basically what our research was about. So the title of the study, Unlocking Low-Cost Renewables in Southeast Europe. was the methodology behind it. We had two case studies. One is Serbia, one is Greece. Serbia is the biggest market in the Western Balkans and country outside of the EU. And Greece is a new member state, and very interesting case because Greece is actually the only country currently in the Southeast European region that clearly announced a coal phase out, and that even before 2030. What we did, we analyzed how a given set of policy financial instruments could reduce the investment risks and the costs connected to that within the, of course, the EU budget framework and the total implementation of the directives, that's the Renewables directives and the Market Design Directive. The key metric was, of course, the weighted average cost of capital. It's two components, cost of equity, cost of debt, and how they are affected by the perceived risks in this region. And we also took a look into the levelized cost of electricity, and we compared LCOE of new onshore wind projects in Serbia and Greece with new lignite projects in both Serbia and Greece. At the end, of course, we quantified how the de-risking measures would impact the cost of capital and LCOE. And our data relied mainly on structured interviews that our local partners, ACER and FATSETS, did in Greece and in Serbia, with private sector investors, with project developers, and with banks. So here I will stop, and I will give the floor to Christian to tell you more about the fascinating results we had.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And yeah, a very good morning or early afternoon to all of you. Pleasure to discuss the findings and conclusions and in turn review of our study. I would like to first start with discussing the impact of the policy environment on the cost of capital for our Greek case study. Before I do this, just to guide you a little bit through the slide. You see here several waterfall diagrams, and on the left-hand side, you see how the cost of equity and the cost of debt are built up, so to speak, starting from a best-in-class country in the EU, that's Germany, where investors face a very stable policy environment, and as such, they perceive their investments as less risky. And then how various policy components and according risks add, so to speak, to the assessment of the investors and financiers for cost of equity and cost of debt in Greece. We see particularly that four risk areas stand out for the Greek case. This is first of all risks related to the power market design. For example, let's say uncertainty related to the specific introduction of new market forces, uncertainties related to balancing requirements, for example. Then we have financial sector risks. This is on the one hand for Greece related to general scarcity of available capital, but also long and deep due diligence processes of banks providing capital, for example. We see also in Greece, at least when these interviews were performed, so the database, so to speak, related to the situation end of 2018, beginning of 2019, a rather big impact of social acceptance, the classical NIMBY procedure, not in my backyard issues, that also contributes to an, let's say, more risky assessment of the situation in Greece. We also see then finally some bigger influences of the counterparty and off-taker risk. So that's basically related to the reliability and credibility of the off-taker in Greece, is basically affected negatively in the sense that the Greek big utility is facing some financial problems. They have a lot of old lignite plants in the system, which perform, let's say, financially in a not a very good manner, and as such, this also might be perceived as a risky counterparty for renewables investors. Now, when we add up all these four main categories, plus, let's say, the impact of several others, we end up with a situation where the cost of equity, also the cost of debt, is roughly 3 times as large as in Germany. And this, of course, as we will see later, of course, critically affects the economics of the studied onshore wind project. The good news is that several de-risking instruments, be it on the policy, national policy dimension, but also the EU framework as described and outlined already by Sonia, is potentially available. And if these de-risking policies are introduced, we see quite a significant reduction potential of this cost of equity and cost of debt, which of course would then increase again the economics of our assessed onshore wind projects. To make a long story short, we see that various or a package of de-risking policies for Greece can lower the cost of equity by almost 5 percentage points and the cost of debt by 2 percentage points. Sonia, if you could switch to the next slide, please. This is, let's say, the feedback from our interview partners, what these main de-risking policies should be in these various risk categories. I focus now only on these 4 main elements, starting again with power market risk. There's clearly, let's say, a lot to be gained by a proper implementation of the new electricity market regulation, which is very detailed provisions on how intraday market design should look like, how the cross-border coupling of the short-term market should look like. This can add liquidity, as such, of course, reduce risks if you trade on those short-term markets, but also with respect to recently adopted provisions with regard to balancing responsibility for wind plants in the Greek power market. There's still, again, let's say, room to fine-tune this regulation, increase liquidity, and lower the risks for producers. When we talk about the financial sector risk, this is on the one hand related, of course, to the policy environment in Greece, related a lot to the framework of renewables support. Greece switched some time ago to an auction mechanism, but their market participants would wish for, let's say, longer auctioning schedules to have better clarity on the future pipeline of auction volumes. This gives also certainty to banks. But this is also a domain where, for example, an EU-level instrument could help a lot. Sonia referred to this EU guarantee instrument, which is currently being discussed in the context of the new budget discussions. We termed this here the so-called RES, Renewables Cost Reduction Facility, which is essentially a guarantee of support payments, national support payments guaranteed by an EU-wide fund, which is presumably very credible as a fallback option. As such, it can effectively eliminate the financing risks. Social acceptance, of course, is a bit of a more softer risk category, but of course, public campaigns can help. And as said, again, this was done end of 2018, beginning of 2019. So, I mean, we have more than a full year of, let's say, Fridays for Future activities, where I would expect that, let's say, the awareness of climate change is much different than 1.5 years ago. And as such, also, presumably, this risk is somewhat lower now if we would redo the study now. With respect to the fourth largest category, the risk related to the counterparty off-taker, here our respondents had some, let's say, hope for the possibility to enter corporate PPAs to circumvent, let's say, an incumbent off-taker which might face some financial problems. But again, of course, here the EU-level instrument to guarantee payments would help significantly. And indeed, we see that as soon as an EU-level instrument is available, the associated financing risks can be lowered or eliminated completely, actually. This is not the case for the instruments which are available for the country itself. If we move to Serbia now, we see a somewhat similar situation. Let's say, ballpark figure would still be that cost of equity, cost of debt is roughly 3 times as high as in Germany. We also see that 4 main risk categories stand out and contributed to the largest extent to this increase, but it's somehow a little bit of a mixed or different, let's say, mix, so to speak, of the different adders to the cost of equity and cost of debt. Specifically, we see that the blue bars in this diagram are higher than for the Greek case, and the blue bars are risks related to the financing. That means that they're an EU-level instrument to also help, let's say, the Western Balkan countries to ease financing constraints would be very effective, because financing risks make up a higher part of the cost of capital in those countries, and as such, if you introduce then your cost of capital can be lowered quite a bit. Again, running through quickly, if you would move to the next slide, Sonia, please. How our interview partners from the renewables investment segment, from the financing segment, have assessed the potential for de-risking. Power market risk is something which is considered critical in the Serbian power market, simply because, of course, the stage of liberalizing and opening up the markets is or has started later and is still ongoing in Serbia and in the Western Balkans. So it also relates a lot to, let's say, bringing liquidity into the balancing market, because there's only, let's say, one big player active. There is not yet the possibility to trade shortly before the gate closure, so intraday markets are missing, and of course there is, let's say, less certainty on the stability of the overall renewables remuneration scheme. This also links, let's say, to financial sector risk. It's a little bit unclear, and also to policy risk, I would say in general. It's a little bit unclear for the market participants, okay, what is the future for Serbian renewables policy? The country itself and also the other Western Balkan partners are in the process of discussing, let's say, 2030 targets for renewables, but this is an ongoing process, which is, of course, then also contributing to uncertainty for investors. For several other risk categories, we see here indeed the room for very effective, let's say, interfering with EU level financing instruments, guarantees under, for example, the Western Balkan investment framework, which quite heavily can contribute to lowering those financing risks. So what does it all mean actually for the economics of projects? We have also looked into the effects on lowering levelized cost of electricity. I mean, there are, of course, mostly experts on this call, but levelized cost of electricity is essentially just calculate the total cost of an investment over its entire lifetime and divided by the entire expected generation of that technology, and then you have some specific average generation cost. And both for Serbia and Greece, we have seen in the context of performing this research, but also with the help of, let's say, the assessment of the renewables investors and the financing institutions, that the de-risking policies, if they were implemented, could lower the LCOE by 20%. So I would say very significantly. For example, if we then look into the Serbian case, where cost for onshore wind could be as low as 54 euros per megawatt hour, compare this to the cost of new lignite power plants, which are still being planned for in Serbia, starting from 73 euros per megawatt hours upwards, and of course not taking into account yet the impact of any carbon pricing instrument. We really see that also in this region, with a dedicated set of de-risking policies, renewables essentially constitute the lowest and the cheapest generation technology. What I think is very interesting to point out is that it was mainly 4 policy areas which contributed to essentially this entire reduction in the LCOE and in the reduction of cost of capital. First and foremost, the proposed EU budget guarantee, as mentioned several times. I will get back to it nonetheless at the end of the presentation. The introduction of the certainty for investors that there is renewables remuneration regimes in place for the longer term, which are considered to be robust and reliable. And this, of course, needs to start, first of all, with binding renewables targets, but also in addition to allow investors to strike PPAs with, for example, energy-intensive industry. And then the whole, let's say, market design discussion to have in place for functioning and also cross-border wise integrated short-term market with a focus on balancing and intraday. Now, I mentioned that these 4 policy instruments were considered to be most powerful to lower the cost of capital. It was specifically the EU some 40% of the risk reduction and the according reduction in capital, both for Serbia and Greece. And I think this points out again to the importance when we link the current discussion on economic recovery out of the Corona crisis with the discussion of developing the new EU's multi-annual financial framework, the budget as of 2021, but also with a view to the Western Balkan countries to have also in this EU budget framework enough room to provide also guarantee instruments for that region. I think this would really be, let's say, the political priority number 1, where countries in the region can benefit a lot, and it would really, let's say, leverage huge amounts of renewables investments. I understand now that some comments came in that my audio connection was not optimum. That's, of course, very annoying. I apologize for that, but yeah, I hope at least that the slides could be viewed clearly and that we have a good discussion now on these main issues. We, of course, are interested to hear also your views on the room to optimize the policy and the financing framework in that region. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and Sonia and me, we look forward to your questions and comments.
Yes, thank you, Sonja and Christian. And I think I can now hand over to Christoph. Let me just quickly remind you of how the Q&A session is going to work. You can put any questions and remarks into the Q&A window, which then Christoph will browse through and pick the ones that are most interesting for the majority, or where we think they are really interesting. And they will then become visible for the rest of the audience. So as long as we haven't picked them and read them out loud, they're invisible to the audience, and only we on the podium can see them. And after that, they will become visible. So do put them in there, whatever comes to your mind. Any questions, just raise them. Today is your opportunity. Christoph.
Yes, thank you so much, Nicola. We have a few questions at least, so you are welcome to pose more questions. The first one I would like to raise is by Jonas Weidel. He's asking, in how far do you see the provisions of the EU Green Deal regarding an integrated energy market as fit to alleviate the power market risks? And I guess that could be a question for you, Sonja.
Thank you, Christoph. Yes, the study was done before the European Green Deal was announced. Of course, we haven't looked into this. It can, of course, I think, especially for Greece, could help. In a way, for Serbia, not so clear, because of course Serbia is currently just negotiating to enter the EU, so they're not an EU member state. So I wouldn't see the effect on Serbia, at least currently, I would say, from the European Green Deal in any sort of helping alleviating the risks. For Greece, yes, I mean, for Greece, I think it's even without the introduction of, I would say, any financial mechanism, the situation was already going into the right direction in a way. They deployed a lot of renewables wind energy last year. And this year, because of the situation on the ground, because of good wind conditions, they had record low electricity price, so price on the spot market, and record high production from wind energy. So already the situation there is quite good, and any sort of backing instrument, whether that's policy like the Green Deal, whether there is any sort of financial mechanism that is currently being discussed within the EU, within the Commission, would help to improve the situation even better. I mean, if we look at the case, they even will probably close the last coal unit 2028. That's even 2 years before 2030.
Thank you. Maybe I could continue with a question by William Judd. He is asking what short-term measures by the private sectors or by private investors can be done to de-risk investments. So not only public policy, but only maybe the private sector. What could he do? I'm not sure, Sonja or Christian.
Christian, do you want to answer this?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a good point. It's a bit hard to answer this question to me. It's a bit hard for me to answer this question, I should say. The private sector is, of course, let's say, operating in the context of the policy, the regulatory, the market environment, which is governed, of course, by national and EU-wide regulation. That's just as far as investors can go. And that this environment allows them to assess their business cases. So I think the private sector should, for example, of course, speak up, voice their concerns. They clearly face, otherwise we would, for example, in that region, not see such high cost of capital. And if, let's say, additional voices are being heard by policymakers, then the more the merrier. Hopefully, adjustments in the policy framework can follow. So in a sense, increasing the pressure that some of the, and I think some of these risks we have identified really, so to speak, low-hanging fruits to be addressed by decision makers. It's just, let's say, a timely implementation of new EU regulations, for example, or EU directives. So not to reinvent the wheel, but to try to implement best practice policy making. And if the private sector, let's say, pushes this, then I would say this is something that should certainly help policymakers to find the right priorities. But yeah, this is maybe a little disclaimer that I may have not understood the question correctly, so apologize, and then please follow up if you disagree with what I said.
Maybe that's also an idea for the next study we conduct. Let's come to the current study now and some assumptions you have set when conducting the studies. So Ulrich Laumans is asking, in the comparison between Germany and Greece, how have existing policy risks in Germany, planning risks, social acceptance, and so on, been taken into consideration? Krista, maybe?
This is a very important, a very important question. And again, I think the main thing I should flag first is this: the interviews were performed end of 2018, where we used for Germany the most available studies on this aspect to identify the cost of equity and cost of debt. This for sure will have changed by now, as will the results would look differently now for Serbia and Greece if you would redo the study now. We all know there are issues with the planning and permitting process, specifically of onshore wind in Germany. This will have certainly increased the risks for investors. We all of Europe and the world now faces also the implications of the coronavirus pandemic. This will probably yield a much different, let's say, risk perception and such also different levels for Germany. I would like to point out nonetheless that, let's say, the focus still was Southeast Europe. And if you wish, the starting point from Germany and ending up in the Greek and Serbian situation is somewhat an eye-catcher to showcase, okay, what is the potential, let's say, inefficient risk in the system and how can it be lowered? And we see that it can be lowered for a certain set of policies, and it can be lowered to a certain extent, and then we can say, oh, well, okay, it's still twice as high as in Germany or not. But I think the important point is there that the region can simply benefit a lot from such mechanisms, and let's say a refined implementation of EU-level regulation, of course, would also then help investors in Germany to move forward. But there, I guess, indeed, for onshore wind, we are mainly discussing issues related to the planning and permitting regime.
Thank you. Next question is by Iritu. He or she, I'm not sure, is asking, what is the rationale of choosing Greece and Serbia as observed cases, and why the technology only went onshore?
I can maybe answer that. Thank you, Christoph. Why? Because we work on that region specifically. So these are maybe just a small explanation. Agora Energiewende works throughout the world in different regions, specifically where you have coal-intensive power sectors. Southeast Europe, it's one of those regions. Me and my colleague Christian are focusing on this region specifically, on the energy transition in this region specifically, the coal to clean, I would say, switch. That is why we chose both Greece and Serbia, because we have ongoing projects there, ongoing network there, etc. Concerning why only onshore wind, that comes down to basically funding. So funding restraints enabled us to be able to focus on just this this technology. But in any case, I would like to say maybe as a side point that anyhow in this region, what we work on, I would say promotion when we speak about renewables specifically, it's wind. So okay, onshore wind, offshore wind, of course, and PV. So that was the, I would say, logic behind why we chose wind and why it was Serbia and Greece.
Okay, thank you. Next questions are also on technologies and the LCOE. So two questions, so one by Irin Bu again, the other one by Kai Steputat. They are asking for the LCOE of hydropower, as they are important for the mix in Southeast Europe, and also for the LCOE of new gas-fired power plants in Serbia or Greece. So if we could comment on those LCOEs for gas and for hydro.
I can, let's say, I mean, we cannot directly answer it, of course, from this study. When you look into power system scenarios for the region, you typically can distinguish, let's say, scenarios which relate to business as usual, and then which relate to a greener future or an energy transition future. And when we look at the scenarios on business as usual, there's still a lot of lignite investments being planned for specifically because typically the scenarios do not consider the implications of future carbon pricing constraints. There is, at least for the Western Balkans, the gas infrastructure not that employed such that investments into new gas plants is neglecting carbon pricing somewhat more expensive than lignite. So I would say if you compare now LCOE for the region Western Balkans without carbon pricing, then lignite is cheaper than gas. But this can, of course, changes quickly if we introduce carbon pricing. And when we look into, let's say, the future of the region, which will be in the European Union, I certainly hope. And when we also look into what the European Union is planning in terms of increasing its ambition with respect to greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2030, currently the EU wants to reduce its emissions by 40%. It's aiming for 50 to 55%. And one of those measures to ensure still the competitiveness of the European industry and avoid carbon leakage is introducing a so-called carbon border adjustment of carbon-intense imports into the EU. And this would also apply to the electricity sector if it's potentially going to be implemented. And that means that the countries in the region who export quite a bit of electricity into the EU would also face directly then the consequences of carbon prices. And then by 2030, we could have already a quite different situation where on the fossil side of things, the LCE of gas are then lower compared to the LCE of lignite. So this is to highlight that this is somewhat a dynamic picture, and it depends a lot really on the likelihood and the magnitude of carbon pricing you assume. For hydro, I would say the main issue is not so much the LCOE comparison, but the issue of the potential. The countries have already deployed quite a bit of hydro potential, and all studies I know, they see some, let's say, increase in the potential, but not that much. So I would say it's really then a restriction mainly from the environment side of things. But clearly, when we compare LCOE of hydro with LCOE of wind and PV, the LCOE of wind and PV would certainly be lower than those of new hydro plants.
If I just may add, because if it's interesting for people why we chose to compare the LCOE actually of new onshore wind and lignite, just as an FYI, I mean, in this region is one of the last remaining regions where there are actually plans for new lignite power plants or were are currently being built. I mean, Greece is actually one of the cases. The Ptolemaida power plant, it's actually currently still being built. I mean, the future is quite uncertain whether it will be switched to a different fuel, specifically gas, or what will happen with the power plant. But Serbia also has plans for new units on lignite. So for us, it's what's quite important actually to show the difference between and how an instrument like this can help the investments in new units, in new megawatts, actually in renewables, can make it cheaper for the entire power sector compared to what the countries or what the utilities pay for the lignite units.
Thank you so much. The next question is by Ganymede Urgulica, and it's on CO2 pricing. Maybe a good add to your last answer, Sonia. How likely do we regard the introduction of the CO2 price in the Western Balkans?
Oof, that's a tough question. Thank you. There are, of course, ongoing discussions in the region, within the energy community of Southeast Europe and EU, the Commission specifically, on introduction of some sort of carbon pricing. Of course, the most recent discussions are to introduce some sort of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which means that any electricity produced, which is for export, will be taxed entering the EU. Because of course the Western Balkans don't have, they are not part of the ETS, they don't have their own ETS, which means they're in a preferential sort of situation compared to the EU countries, which are in the ETS. The energy community is discussing and currently doing studies on introducing some sort of carbon pricing within its contracting parties, the Western Balkans specifically. The enforcement, however, is, I would say, still problematic. Of course, it comes down to the countries themselves, the governments themselves, to decide whether they will introduce something or not. Montenegro, for instance, has some sort of a very basic low carbon pricing, but it is there. Whether the other countries would follow, it depends on a lot of factors, but of course it depends on, I would say, pressure also from outside parties, from civil society, from the EU, from the energy community, about the need, I would say, to introduce this in order to accelerate the convergence with EU and with the energy union itself.
Thank you. One of the last questions I would like to pose is by Alexei Mikhailenko, and it's also on our assumptions and methodology. How did your team evaluate or calculated each risk component for cost of debt and cost of equity? So what's the methodology there?
The methodology is based on a publicly available tool developed by the United Nations Development Program, the so-called DREI initiative, De-risking Renewables Initiative. And there is a financial model available which assesses, on the one hand, the cost of capital and cost of debt structure, but also then the levelized cost of electricity has been applied several times outside Europe, specifically for projects with, for example, IFIs in Africa, etc. And basically our model, our methodology uses this model. We work together with the experts from the New Climate Institute, who did the quantitative work, and we fed this model by a assessment of the regulatory framework through structured interviews with renewables developers in those two countries and financing institutions, so mainly, of course, banks also being active in those two countries. And then, of course, you need a certain amount of interviewees to get robust assessments, both in the, let's say, pre-de-risking and post-de-risking case. And this, semi-quantitative, semi-qualitative interviews allowed to feed the data into this model I mentioned, and as such, the results were calculated.
Okay, thank you. And one question to broaden the perspective, it's actually the last question. We have two questions in the same direction. So this one is by Till Albinger. How would you estimate the impact of China's energy investments, especially in the coal sector, to the energy transition in Southeast European countries? Actually, this is this question.
Sorry, Christoph, on China, is China's investments in the coal sector?
Yes, how do we regard China's energy investments in the Western Balkans,
yep.
Southeast Europe?
Well, maybe just as an FYI, the DL that you saw in the presentation of specifically for Serbia or for the new lignite units are actually new lignite units which are built with Chinese loans. So of course, I mean, that's an issue that it's, I would say, ongoing. The discussions are ongoing concerning investments, specifically in fossil fuel sectors within the region. But not only that, for instance, last week was published also that with Chinese funds, there will be a new hydropower plant being built in Bosnia and Herzegovina, specifically in the Republika Srpska part. And this is, of course, all part of the Belt and Road Initiative. What we believe that there needs to be more discussion, not only with the Western Balkans parties, but also between China, the region, and the EU concerning these, I would say, investments. There is currently not so much of a discussion, that's more fragmented. There are different reasons why these countries take these loans and investments. There are a lot of, I mean, there is a background why that's happening. Should there be alternatives to that? Yes, we're trying to work on the alternatives. There is also maybe more or less, maybe not so vocal about it, but there are, I mean, loans, grants through the EBRD. For instance, EBRD now it's helping the auction scheme in Serbia. EBRD helped a PV power plant in North Macedonia, etc., etc. So there is more concerted effort needed, I would say, in communication, Belt Road Initiative, region of Western Balkans, Southeast Europe, and the EU, in sort of finding a way to divert investments from fossil fuels to renewables. But that's a really an ongoing discussion currently. Unfortunately, not too much, especially with the pandemic.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you very much to all of you for posing questions. Unfortunately, we are not able to pose all questions here publicly due to time constraints, but we will have a look on all questions afterwards, and maybe we will come back to you for more details afterwards. So from my side, thank you very much. And I'm handing over again to Nicola.
Yes, thank you, Christoph. It looked like the audience was a bit shy today because there weren't many questions in the beginning, but then during the last 15 minutes, they popped in and we had more than 20. So there's, we never need to be worried that there won't be enough questions. We always have more than we can answer, unfortunately. Or no, it's actually good because apparently there's still a lot more to discuss. Thank you, Sonia and Christian, for presenting the results of the study to us, and Christoph for browsing through the questions and posing them on behalf of the audience. The recording of the webinar will be available on the website, hopefully already tomorrow, otherwise in the course of the week or next week. And you can download the study and the presentation and everything from our website. Maybe, Christoph, you can put it again into the chat so people who joined later see it. And if you want to be kept up to date on our webinars, you may register to our newsletter if you're not yet on the mailing list. We will have a week or two of webinar breaks because we do have some other events going on, but we will be back beginning of June. I think the first webinar is already scheduled for the 9th, and once I have the data, we will publish it on the website. So visit our website, subscribe to our newsletter in order not to miss anything. Thanks for joining until the end, and now have a good lunch, stay healthy still, stay at home still, and keep the distance, even though it's difficult, I know, but I guess we have to continue with this. And see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you all.
Bye-bye.